Um, Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by thanking the Georgetown Law School and the McCourt School of Public Policy for hosting us in this, by the way, gorgeous building. And thank you to the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality team for planning this event. I know it's a lot of work to pull these things together. The weather thwarted us the first time. It threatened to do so today, and I'm just really glad we're here. I'm Rebecca Gomez. I'm a program officer at the Heising Simons Foundation, and I've had the unique pleasure of supporting the GCPI team for the past 7 years. First, for the amazing work they did on the transition playbook in 2019 and 2020, which offered concrete policy recommendations to the incoming administration to make child and family policy more just, equitable, and functional. From there, we saw the value of a team that was dedicated to applied policy research that focused on the most vulnerable populations in our society and crafting policy recommendations that could improve their lives, and bringing in a team that had lived experience and expertise on the issues that they were dedicated to working on. At the foundation, our strategy focuses on a goal of universal access to affordable early care and education experiences. And in my career, I've worked as an early educator who was paid poverty wages. I've worked in government to try to make the lives of kids, families, and the early childhood workforce better, and as an applied policy researcher myself. All of this is to say, for me, it seems only logical to support such an amazing team of researchers and leaders at the Georgetown Center for Poverty and Inequality. And I'm pleased to be here with you today to learn from our speakers, Shalanda and Lelaine, who I will introduce in a moment. Before I do, I want to remind us why we are here and why this moment matters so much. We've come together today at a time when this administration, Congress, and SCOTUS are making sweeping policy changes that have already fundamentally shaped the role of government in society. As a former civil servant raised by civil servants, I've watched often with unspeakable grief as the civil service has been hollowed out and critical government functions and funding streams eradicated. Many of you already know the impact of this on people's daily lives. Costs are rising, people's civil liberties are being curtailed or taken away wholesale. It's a scary time. And so budget and policy debates right now may seem abstract, but the truth is they profoundly affect people's daily lives. And so they are very concrete. They reflect our shared values, who we are as a nation, who is included in that we, whose futures are prioritized, and who has a voice. Across the country, families and workers are feeling the pressures of rising costs, with things like housing and childcare becoming increasingly unaffordable and unattainable. And so this moment demands clarity, leadership, and solutions that are grounded in the reality of what people need to live full lives. Budget policy is one key tool for justice and equity. And through the programs it manages and policy tools it uses, the Office of Management and Budget helps decide whether gaps in people's ability to meet their needs are closed or allowed to widen. Budget decisions determine whether parents can get enough food on the table, whether they have childcare that is affordable and stable, and whether they can pay their rent or mortgage. And we are here today to focus on what actually works: strong institutions, credible leadership, and budget choices that reflect our values and meet real needs. Now, I want to step back and say I'm a big Star Trek fan. And lately, I've been watching the newest show in the franchise, which is Starfleet Academy. And the context of that show is that it's set over 1,000 years in the future when the United Federation of Planets is in the process of rebuilding after a catastrophic collapse of civilization. Society is in the process of coming back together after decades of scarcity, authoritarian rule, jingoism, and isolationism. And the charge of the first group of cadets at the newly revived academy is to learn the necessary hard and soft skills of rebuilding a society and making one that is just and equitable. More importantly, these young people are learning to embody the values of the Federation, one that has long valued justice, equity, collaboration, diversity, shared prosperity, and leadership that works for all people, not just some. And so similar to the Federation, as we think about doing the work of rebuilding and reshaping and evolving society according to a set of shared values, we will need leaders that deeply understand the challenges we face as a society and how to create sound policy solutions to meet the moment. And with that very nerdy context, I'm so pleased to introduce two leaders who have been central to this work and who are meeting the moment we are in and who will help lead us going forward. Lelaine Bigelow, the Executive Director of the Georgetown Center of Poverty and Inequality. I'm sorry, my voice. And Shalanda Young, former OMB Director, and Doris Duke, Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at the McCourt School. Shalanda's experience in government gives unique insight into how national priorities become real-world outcomes. And Lelaine's experiences here at GCPI is focused on keeping people and communities at the center of policy debates. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Shalanda and Lelaine.
Is this your good side?
Yeah, I found out I am better forward, not on a side. That's what, yeah. Yeah, so, yeah. So you get my bad side, unfortunately. So, yeah. So thank you, Rebecca, for that wonderful table setting and welcome. I appreciate so much you being here, and of course, the longstanding commitment to our work by Heising Simons Foundation. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who is here today. I know in DC, it's so easy to, kind of skip the things in the rain and the cold weather. So I appreciate everyone coming out here today. And a lot of people were asking me, are you sure? Don't you just want to move this to Zoom? It'll be easier. But I've known Shalanda for a long time, and I can tell you she is great in person. And I wanted everyone else to have that experience as well. So again, appreciate you being here. So we're calling this conversation The Future We Build because we are at an extraordinary present day. And I think for me, for all of us to gather and think about the future and what we can do is an important part of the work because we want to make progress. And progress happens when people and institutions live up to our ideals of opportunity, democracy, and a fair chance for everyone. So in seventh grade, I had a civics class, and Mr. Dreisbach, we were doing some type of simulation. People were named like the president and HHS secretary. And that's when I first learned about the Office of Management and Budget. Did I get the Office of
Seventh
Management?
grade?
Yes, seventh
Wow.
grade. And he was a great civics teacher, and he talked about how OMB was the most powerful. And I was like, ooh, I like that. And I will say he named me OMB director, and I love that. And I was like, I have all of this power. I don't know what happened after that, to be honest.
I said I was the second woman to serve.
No,
I was the third.
no, the crown is yours. The crown is yours. But, so this is like my seventh grade dream kind of coming true, that I get to have this conversation with you. And I've always, since that moment, have always thought about this agency as unknown and Washington's secret. So that's why I'm really glad to share you and share what you have done in this conversation. So let's just dive right in.
Yeah.
Okay. So as leader of OMB, you manage the $7 trillion federal budget. You've often talked about how budgets are a reflection of one's values. OMB is often seen as technical, but really where priorities become real. So let's start there. What is OMB's real power, and how have you seen it translate into meaningful improvements in people's daily lives, especially around equity?
Well, one, it's always funny. People are like, $7 trillion. That was not my household budget. I still open the Pepco bill and go, what?
Yeah.
Which I also think it's helpful to have people in these jobs who grew up and continue to have to budget and prioritize, and they have some idea of what Americans go through. I've been in the bubble of DC for almost 25 years, but my family ensures that it does not become all-encompassing. As a matter of fact, they still don't quite know what I do. My dad, when he was still alive, would still tell people I worked at the Capitol, and I gave up. I'm at the different building on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But it was incredibly important for my family that this does not go to my head, and became incredibly important to my service, that this didn't become real.
Yeah.
Because most people don't have time to think about what we are doing in this town.
Mhm.
I still remember Lelaine's husband and I worked together for a long time, Chris, who thank you for showing up to see, both of us who you see enough of. But I remember Adam Smith once in a ranking members meeting years ago, somebody said, like, people don't vote their interests. And he said something I still take with me, like, don't say that. They do. They just prioritize them differently than you think they should. So I try to remember that as, we can get like judgy about people's politics, vote here, this will do well for you. We have to remember government has let people down regardless of who has been in a White House. We wouldn't have had an equity agenda had government been everything to everybody. And I try to like frame these Trump times during that. One, I think it's a singular time because he's a singular figure.
Yeah.
So I spend a lot of my time reminding people don't overly focus here. This is a period of time, and we have to think about progress and how we bounce back from these times. And if one wants to be an optimist, which I tend to be, now when you were asked these questions in rooms, how would you develop HUD from scratch? This is kind of the moment to have those thoughts that become reality. When there's a different president who appreciates what government can do for and with people. So I never want to enter these discussions like government was perfect and this guy's ruined it. He's ruined a lot. But government has never been the shining beacon we always want it to be. But I think the difference is many of us who worked in it, our ultimate goal was to make it that bright example, especially when you're thinking about global affairs, ensure this country was the beacon and light and example that others want to follow. That means doing what's right no matter where you grew up in this country, like the small town I grew up in, Louisiana.
Mhm.
I had a great civics teacher, not seventh grade, but in 10th grade, Miss Green.
Yeah.
I did not know anything about OMB, but I teach a class in McCourt, and I had one student like, I don't understand anything about this budget stuff. I was like, what do you care about? Just tell me what you care about. Climate. Well, where would you spend our next dollar? Like all of these issues you care about, the budget is a way to get at those in a consequential way, which is often why you see these fights on appropriations bills or reconciliation packages. They're trying to get at issues through the money,
Mhm.
which is why we always say, and President Biden always says, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value.
Yeah.
And that is the way I decided to contribute to our country, like where we spend our next dollar. What's the thing we choose to do as a country? The next thing, you could do it from any other policy angle, way to get there. You could serve on a different, a policy committee in Congress. But one way that is a formidable force is what you spend your money on.
Right.
It's same in your household.
Right. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but like, can you put that into context over, like you said, the long term? I mean, oftentimes, both of us have had public service and programs aren't perfect. And, we've been on both sides of the meeting of trying to make sure things get better. But, would you just talk a little bit more about, the build you have to get to in order to make change?
Well, one is, child tax credit like sticks in my brain. We saw something that worked incredibly well and we didn't continue it. And it is one of the highlights of my career being involved, but also one of the things that pisses me off the most. Who could see that data and not like double down that this was the right thing to do, that families, if given the flexibility from government, make the right choices for their families. And some of the things said in that discussion about how policymakers, how politicians thought about their own constituents is, still bothersome to me.
Yeah.
But typically, one thing government doesn't do a lot of, I always thought we could, but this showed that idea may have been wrong, is do more piloting, getting data and making the case. Well, we had that case study.
Yeah.
So the new lesson I take is do things for a longer period of time so people feel it and it's hard to deny. I think the Affordable Care Act gives us that example. People need to feel it. People need to understand it. Social Security, Medicare is our long-term example with that. The Affordable Care Act is our medium-term example. And child tax credit shows us when we don't do that, how we fail in policy design. But we're trying to save money.
Yeah.
And it comes back to prioritizing. We thought it would be so, the data would be so overwhelming that people can deny. It turns out they can because, in my view, it did not go on long enough. We did not design it long enough. Now, corporate tax rates, Republicans are like, they might be unpopular, so I'm going to make those permanent. We have to have the same wherewithal on programs we believe in to get as long of a period for them so they are proven to the American people and people rise up and demand those programs continue.
Yeah. I feel like if I was taking, I'd be furiously writing that down. So like that is like such a key legislative strategy. Well, we talked a little bit, you talked a little bit about the scarcity mindset. So I think it's an appropriate time to talk about when you were at OMB, we saw your authority used very well and enabled delivery. Like you said, the CDC, yeah. At other moments, maybe now, we've seen it used very differently. What guardrails are supposed to exist around that authority, and what happens when those guardrails weaken?
I mean, like half of me is jealous, right?
Yeah.
Like I didn't know I had that level of flexibility.
Right,
And
right. Who knew?
I didn't know I could tell Congress to stop being bipartisan and, just do what I say and send up rescissions packages that are illegal in less than 45 days and people will just take it. So half of me is jealous and like, I'm not lying. It's funny, but I'm not lying. It's probably because I came from the Hill that's just, that level of abuse by the executive branch with regard to their relationship and Congress's role. I don't want anything to do with that.
Right.
But I got to tell you, Congress has got to step up here. No president, I don't care R&D behind it, is going to give up this forcefulness, this level of power. Some of you who want a different president to be forceful on any number of programs will go, well, the last guy did it. And it was like, but you also said you didn't want presidents running over Congress. And like, yeah, for that stuff.
Yeah.
What about for this stuff? So decide where your democratic morals lie, because you have to answer that very quickly. Back to the class in McCourt, I was like, they're in love with civil servants. I was like, I started as a civil servant. Let me ask you, if I told you I had staff at OMB that didn't want me to name the thing you care about, you want me to overrule them? Well, it's like, there are principles we have to live within. I could have easily, overturned decisions by my civil servants, but because I had worked for a president who believed in democracy and our system of government and the Constitution, like the way we approach things, we try to bring more data to the table, have conversations, convince our teams that, this score, why it should be this and not this. The alternative is to do with this OMB director, like by fiat. They can get a lot more done. And the next Democratic president, Democratic Congress are going to have to decide where those new norms are.
Yeah.
Definitely don't do the illegal stuff.
Right. Yes.
Definitely don't do that. But there might be some other norms we want to put back on the table, even if these guys did it and did it to great effect for their agenda. By the way, it's also easier to break norms when you want to break government and not do stuff.
Right.
It is harder, and some of these tools will not be available for an affirmative agenda to do things. If you want more money out of Congress, you can't like just blow through them and ignore them in a way you can when you don't want something from them. So some of these tactics, people are learning lessons, but there are limitations to those lessons because we want different things.
Right. And I think you are naming a tension or a conversation that will probably happen over the next few years and a debate that's to come about how to use power. So I think that's really important for us, again, to have out there and to have this conversation, because there is an attractiveness to parts of it, but like how, again, do we make sure that we institutionalize these democratic norms at the same time and have an equalized power. So we've talked a little bit about institutions, and we'll transition to talking about people. At GCPI, we love people-centered policy. So we have a people-centered punch at our reception. The last event that we did together, you didn't have a cocktail, so I made sure we had our mocktails up here.
I was like,
it's a little early. I don't have a watch on, but it's early. It's a mocktail, but it's people-centered punch. So we can have a little sip as we transition. So at GCPI, if you don't know a lot about us, we connect research and lived experience to design policy solutions that reduce poverty. And I sometimes joke that I'm a recovering lobbyist who finally got their hands on a research and data team. And you talked about research and data, and I also want to bring together this narrative piece, because I think that goes in hand with talking to policymakers. So when we talk to policymakers about economic well-being, we are really trying to talk about whether or not people can care for themselves and the people they love. Policy works best when it's designed for those carrying the greatest caregiving and economic burdens, especially women of color. And you've held one of the most powerful economic roles in government, and you're also a mom to Charlie. So from where you sat, what would it mean for government to take care, infrastructure seriously in economic policy, not just in words, but how it actually designs programs and budgets?
Oh, I mean, there goes the challenge. I think everyone in this room can probably tell us what good policy is. And we'll all probably agree and shake our heads. The challenge becomes, can you communicate that effectively to the American people and explain to them why it's good for them, like as a human being?
Right.
And I don't think I appreciated before the last 4 years. If you lose the communications game, you've lost it all.
Right.
And I think the Biden presidency, for however it ended in the political side, did a lot of good policy. Did people know it came from that president? I think the jury is still out on that. But I think history will be kind to the policy. But it kind of doesn't matter if we weren't able to get our message across and get people to care about those things and why that impacted. I think the federal government itself has a fundamental problem. You feel what mayors do in a real way. I mean, Muriel Bowser could not run into me after a snowcrete. It is a very tactile relationship between constituent and your local politicians. Same with state legislatures, also governors. Imagine you actually get to take referendums to voters. There's no question about whether you have mandates. You can ask them. I've thought a lot about this. Federal government doesn't have that. I probably don't think we should. Don't take from this. I think we have federal mandates, but it does put you at a deficit on how we develop programs and then convince the American people why those things are good for them. And remember, I think the grand bargain Democrats and Republicans struck that is being unwound as we speak, but that struck 30, 40 years ago was, all right, you want to spend these things. The only way I'll agree to that is send a bunch of block grants. And we lose that narrative once we do that. infrastructure law. The president would go somewhere, he's like, where's it say any of these projects were done by the federal government, Joe Biden?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, sir, we give it through formula, and then the governors put their face on it. Where the federal government is able to deliver directly, like Medicare, like Medicaid as a partner with the state, like SNAP as a partner with the state, do a pretty good job on how people perceive government service. We'll never have a like made by U.S. government stamp. Like people experience their government by what they need, but we do a pretty good job in how we relate to people and how people experience the government. I do like spend a lot of my time thinking about program design and convincing the American people like why this stuff is great. We lose some of that, and you know, when we give these things away, child care block grant, like great if it goes to a governor and mayor who want to open up slots, pay child care workers more, like they did in DC when my kid was in daycare. But not great when it goes to some states who decide, you know, the computer programs need updating, which is what happens. So this like direct impact to people, moms like myself, like where do you see it? I saw it in DC, pay our daycare workers more. That's not the experience others have. And I knew where that money came from because I was involved in it. You don't otherwise. And I think we need to think through that problem. Sewer and water grants, like governors have decided who winners and losers are there. You know, I will always remember a New York Times reporting on Loudness County in Alabama, like predominantly Black community, waste still going into people's backyards. Like, how long have we been doing these grants, billions and billions every year? And how did this happen? Well, the federal government loses it once it goes out. And what the Trump administration is doing, we have to do a better job is how do we put these grant notices out with requirements around them that reflect the values of lawmakers and presidents who are putting this money out. And we have got to be more forceful about that if we're going to be stuck in this continuum of, and you know, governors and mayors know best. However, where we don't share values, we do lose the plot, and communities are being left behind.
That you said something, and so I'm going to switch up my sort of tougher question a little bit and say I feel like there has been a big conversation around values that sometimes get translated into regulations. And I don't know if you had a chance to read the abundance book, but you know that's been a little bit of the debate that we have seen certainly on housing. I believe in that book, and you know we don't have to talk about housing, but I will say in the book it was referenced. Paid leave was referenced as paid time off, which you know I was none too happy about because they're not the same. But you know I think there's clearly a tension there about like operationalizing those values in the federal government, which is large. And I was at HUD during the Obama administration, and I can tell you, like, I heard from members all the time about, you know, their housing projects that were just delayed by 10 years, you know, trying to go through environmental review. So, you know, I can understand where we are. But yeah, if you'd just like to comment on that a little bit, I'd love to, you know, hear about how you think about that tension.
One, if anyone tells you they have the answer and it's black and white, they're lying to you. I think a lot of these are thought exercises that are important. That's how I take the abundance movement. It's an important thought exercise. It is not the answer. You know, in this country, it's just human nature. The further you fix a problem and you get away from it, you forget. You forget what building on wetlands did to communities. I'm from Louisiana. I can remind them from 2005 what it does to communities. These regs are in place for a reason. Do they need to be updated? Absolutely. People who complain about them, especially in Congress, I'm like, go pass a law. they have an outlet in which to do this in a more direct way. These same regulations members complain about, they gave agencies the authority to go regulate because they couldn't come up with more specific suggestions in legislation. So I get worried people take a thought exercise and think it's a solution to everything. If anything, I've heard this young like Israel, I cannot remember her last name, Houghton maybe, you know, have real concrete ideas on the local level. Definitely zoning requirements, where you allow things, NIMBYism. And just look at LA after the fires, probably have more impact on housing and multifamily housing than any federal regulation does. You know, it just takes a lot of effort to tell people the truth. Like, you get these calls and you're like, let me run this down. And a month later you call back and it's like, that's not what it is at all.
Right.
And I do, governors also, there's an effort, like, are they the better decision makers because they are a bit more removed from city councils who are so close to communities? It is hard for them to make these zoning decisions. I think those are concrete things on the state and local level that will have huge impacts on housing, for example.
Right.
But this idea of like, we have all these regs on the books that if we take 1,000 off, like we're going to see this big housing boom, is just not true. It's just absolutely not true.
Right.
And if you look at the history of most of them, there was a reason.
Right.
We need to know like where we were in the 70s
Mm-hmm.
and 80s to figure out like why we are now regulating the way we are in environment, our building codes, but certainly with housing, state and local reform, where decisions get made, how zoning decisions, how you push back against NIMBYism. Those things have much more impact than what we're doing on the federal level.
Right. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I think it is a very, like you said, interesting thought discussion. And I hope that we continue to have it and that policymakers want to have that discussion with all of us.
When Trump tells you they kill like all these regs, I mean, some of that was literally Joe Biden's executive order saying that federal workers could have Christmas like that Thursday because Christmas is on the Friday. You know, like some of the stuff is not real. These numbers are made up, like the stuff that you can take off the books if you want to say I killed 1,000 regs were not repeatable. They were not substantive. You know, we're in the political climate. It always has been where you throw these things out. But if you look at the substance of them, it's not contributing to real policy making. Some of the things that we should get rid of because they didn't matter in the first place from a policy perspective.
Right. Okay. Well, we are going to transition to the last half or the last 10 minutes. And so if you have questions for Shalanda, please start thinking of them now. But before we get to that part, I want to make sure we sort of transition to talking about, again, what does this mean? We are talking about power. How do we get it? How do we keep it? And how do we wield it? And how do we engineer the change that we seek? And in your recent essay, The Power of the Purse, a Symptom of a Larger Institutional Decline, you argue that today's battles over spending authority reflect something deeper, a weakening of institutional norms and governing capacity. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you wrote and how that might tell us how to build reform that can endure political cycles?
Sure. One word, Iran. War powers.
Mm-hmm.
People expected me to write something about the budget, so I did, but not really. It is one of the things, if you look at Congress's, it didn't start with this president. And I think the power of the purse was one of the last declines in Congress's power. I think it lasted longer than the others. It also made the case that it's probably the place to push back against presidents, not speaking just about this president. It is the closest thing to constituents that they see. And, something has to give. It's this acceptance that Congress is broken, and that's okay. We'll have workarounds in the presidency and the executive branch, and the courts will decide the rest. And that has been happening for a long time. If the presidency was broken in the same way Congress is, there would be an outcry that we don't see about Congress's dysfunction. That bothers me. You know, I sat and listened to two constitutional law experts, and my one question to them after was like, you talked about two branches. What about Congress? And they kind of go, oh, they. And one was like, he told this story, he teaches con law. And his last class, very bright student, one of his best, like raised her hand and talks about the political branch closest to the people. And she was talking about the executive branch. And he goes, I have failed you.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, it wasn't her. Like but this is the visual, this is the narrative, this is the reality of how we are operating. There have been glimmers of hope. You've seen both parties come together on tariffs a little bit. You've seen appropriations deals, but then you hear members of Congress are like, we'll stop shutdowns by doing automatic bills to keep government open when we can't come to agreements. Like, the thing that needs to happen less is that they don't work together. Like, approach is ugly, but they find a deal. There is some huge value to that. They have forgotten how to do hard things, which is why I made the case like approach is like the last bastion. They sit in a room and hash it out, and it is broken to everyone outside. I would venture to tell you the rest is even more broken because they don't even talk about it. Because it is on automatic pilot, because we have enough war authorities out there that we let presidents go do these things without full debate in Congress.
Right.
Because Congress gave its tariff authorities away in underlying legislation. Look, when they did this stuff, they could not envision this moment. Like, I don't blame them. You still, like, chairmen and members and leadership back then, like, if you crossed them and did something like this president's doing, there were consequences. So when they passed these laws that gave some of their inherent authority away, they could not have envisioned a president who would take it as far as he has.
Right.
But if we're in this moment, and remember, at some point I said, no president's going to give it back. Congress has to go like, then you can't have it. Then you cannot have it. I didn't say the word apportionment until the first Trump administration. I did budget like years before that. I never thought about it because it was never abused in this way. Now that it is, should my old agency have that authority? Period. They can't be trusted with it. Congress has to reevaluate what they have given away and take some of it back. And, you know, using things for good. We can all opine about the ways they used to be. I'm more of a believer in this is where we are.
Yeah.
So Congress has to answer for this moment.
There might be a Congress bent up here between
Just
both of us, just a little bit. So I will acknowledge that.
But sitting at OMB, I'm like, could you all please just let me do what I want to do? So there is this pull, and I keep saying like, you need to decide where your Democratic like this high ground is when there's a president who's more in line with your values. Will you want them to use some of this power and roll over Congress in a way to get your agenda? Sometimes you have to choose between this vision of how democracy should run and your policy priority. They don't always align.
And so I think my last question will talk a little bit about that tension and say that you have been in a lot of situations where you've had to move forward, both leading the Appropriations Committee as OMB director, and you've had to work closely with policymakers, and the way forward was somewhere in between refusal to compromise, and too willing to compromise. So tell me how you thought about your North Star and how to move forward in those situations.
Debt ceiling is a good example. 2023, Speaker McCarthy let the White House know under no certain terms they could lift the debt ceiling without some compromises on the budget from the White House and from Democrats in Congress. And we're back in the cycle of using the debt ceiling. By the way, that's a newer occurrence that didn't really start until the Obama administration. But once you start, you don't stop. And we had a choice to make. So for a couple months, some of us, including at the podium, go, we're not negotiating. Yeah. And then it's like, well, maybe so. We cannot have our first ever default on our watch.
Right.
And, we can stand there and I think we tried to use terms that made it sound like it wasn't a negotiation, but we negotiated. And we ate a little crow for it, but whatever, you do what's best for the country. And there were a fair number, the numbers of Republicans are, larger and larger who believe that default is nothing. Like we're exaggerating. I'm like, this is not the kind of thing you want to, like, let's drop a pin and see. We're talking cash in, cash out. Let's see how much money we get in Treasury today, and I'll tell you whether or not I can pay your grandmother's hospital bills. This is not a shutdown. This is literally cash on hand. So different scale that this country has never seen because we've never defaulted, but there are some who just don't believe it.
Right.
And kind of want to see. So debt ceiling presented that choice. Do you negotiate or do you play hardball? Do you sit down? We sat down. And the North Star is, you try to give up as little as possible because it's also not real.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know what the other side, what their problems are as much as you know yours.
Mm-hmm.
And I know congressional Republicans.
Right.
I knew what Kevin McCarthy was up against. And at some point, I think negotiations, I go, well, I have tried to solve for your problems for 3 days now. I'm done. I quit your side. I now have to go back to working for my side. Like literally, will this work for you guys? Will this work? Will that work? So knowing what everyone needs to frankly save face. And be a known factor so they know you're telling the truth when you go, hey, you need Democrats? Can't do that. Work requirements? We got to have something. Well, the something better be as little as possible because I shed votes at that moment.
Yeah.
But having been in the space and knowing that they could take your word for it. Mm-hmm. So trying to give up as little as possible to keep your caucus unified, but also knowing what they are up against and trying to create political space for them in order to get the votes. And frankly, I think we got 76% of the House Democratic caucus to vote for that package, 70% of the Republican caucus, everyone was mad at us. And that means we probably did as good of a job as anybody. And going in and saying, I'm sorry we had to go here at all.
Yeah.
We didn't want to do any of this. This is where they started. This is where we pulled back for them and trying to do as little damage as possible. Because again, it's not real. If one really cared about the fiscal trajectory of this country, one is not fooling around with the appropriations process.
Yeah.
Like you can cut half and we're still $38 trillion in debt. So it's not a real thing when people tell you they're worried about our fiscal path and they're talking about the smallest part of where we spend. Yeah. So knowing it's a fake political exercise to begin with, knowing the difficulties the other side of the aisle, who are in the majority, who have to give you votes and who are dealing with, and giving them enough of protecting the values of the Democratic caucus is how we approach it. But the biggest North Star is knowing nothing was worse than default. Nothing.
Right.
And once that is, and that's where the president was. Mm-hmm. So knowing that, you had to come up with a deal.
Right. Well, I feel like this has been a masterclass in legislative strategy and insight, so thank you. I want to open it up for the audience for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Bennett will come with a microphone. And if you could identify, tell us your name and your affiliation and ask a question. Of course, some light commentary is okay, but we hope that there's a question there as well.
I just did House
Yeah.
Democratic Retreat where
Yeah.
no one had a question.
Yeah. Well, we have a lovely question over here with one with pink glasses.
Thank you for noticing my glasses.
Yes.
So Khadijah Williams, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at Lyft. So my question is, on the one hand, we see people are like, oh, there's partisan gridlock, but then we see things that are not partisan, like the child tax credit. And so what would you say are policymakers' kind of least utilized resource in successfully cutting through that partisanship and actually getting things passed that support American communities and families?
Well, we couldn't get the child tax credit deal past the Senate. So it's bipartisan until people actually put their votes where their mouth is. So I'm not giving anybody credit until we get it back. And that deal didn't even bring CTC back in its fullness, but I would have taken it. Because I'm one of those people, I'm Nita Lowey alum, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Mm-hmm.
I live in that space. We could use a lot more of that energy in policymaking. Give policymakers some room to get there. On CTC, like the advice I would give is like know where the roadblocks are. Like even if they aren't your area. Crapo said the thing out loud, like, and if you don't normally follow finance or tax policy, you miss this, but it was incredibly important for the child tax credit. It's like this huge deal passed the House, like the Senate, really? Like the compromising, he goes, well, I can't admit that tax cuts need offsets. Like it was huge if you listen for it. That deal did not get passed in the Senate because the chief tax writer knew that if he set that precedent, I don't think he fundamentally was opposed to child tax credit, and he wasn't opposed to the thing paying for it. It was a good offset the administration agreed to, but this precedent, if Republicans started admitting that tax cuts were spending just like spending was, how do you do something like the big beautiful bill?
Yeah.
And so look at the things that may not be your area of expertise, but it was a barrier to getting that done in a huge way. That is what stood in the way.
Mm-hmm.
It also, we all have to get smarter and be more aggressive on tax policy.
Right.
Because the barrier to getting a lot of the affirmative agenda that costs money done is how do you pay for it?
Right.
Because Republicans will find religion. Whatever your religion is, mine is Christianity. So my grandmother would say they found Jesus. They will on debt and deficits in a way they totally forgot about with the big, beautiful bill. They will now start throwing up 38, 39, $40 trillion that they gave us the path for. So when we are doing this development, we all have to get smart on the revenue side of insisting that revenues be a part of any conversation we have about spending.
Right.
What we bring in matters as much as what we put out.
Right. Yeah, that's such a great, actually, strategy when I think about, again, I think the agenda that will come up in a year or in a couple of years. So thank you. That was a great insight. Meredith?
Hi, I feel like the talking about tax policy and investments was like my love language. So thank you. That's my commentary. But my question is more, thinking about appropriators and folks on the Hill and the guardrails you need, knowing that I'm Meredith Dotson, Coalition on Human Needs. And knowing the way that you've worked so closely with folks on the Hill, I was wondering if you could talk about, to be frank, are you hearing outreach from Republican appropriators, longtime staff, where they just need kind of the political courage because they know that what Congress is ceding in terms of the power of the purse.
No.
It's not like they're secretly uncomfortable and just don't have the courage to push back.
don't
We
like
need to
it.
rebuild. We need to
They
rebuild.
don't like it, but when you have the presidency, the thing members have gotten way too comfortable with is when your party's in charge, they get to call. You saw that come out with the chairman of the committee, Tom Cole, had a oopsies where he put out the list of things that he had saved by calling OMB, and people go, well, what about my stuff? You know, his was directed to his constituents, but his colleagues noticed, and Democrats do it too. I was shocked by the number of members, including senators, who call him like, can you call Senator so-and-so's like, did you see him on the floor? Like it is you know, this general feeling that members, there's not this closeness and people aren't working together. I saw it firsthand. You know, and I started on the Hill. I worked for Dave Obey, who was known for his not sunny personality. And I was like, I can't even imagine Dave Obey calling the OMB director, asking their help, like to get their members in line or ask a different chairman to like include something in a bill. Like that's their business. They're supposed to work that out and then we'd be very unhappy about it. And I think both parties have gotten used to this when they have the White House using those phone calls to get things, and therefore being willing to let go of larger grievances, things the administration will do against the institution itself, because they feel like they got their needs taken care of. You know, New Hampshire.
Mhm.
The New Hampshire governor called about, you know, immigration enforcement in her state. You know, this is, you know, this is kind of par for the course in our modern governance structure.
Right.
It's like Congress doesn't speak as an institution, as if you have the White House, like you at least got your top 2 or 3 concerns dealt with.
Mhm.
So you didn't need to go back to the institution to figure out how to do that in a bipartisan way. I don't know how to fix that, but that is, I believe, what is happening.
Right.
Yeah, when you see them in the hallway, they go, mm. Like you, and I go, you miss me?
All right. Do we have any other questions? Plaid.
Hello, my name is Jack. I'm a student at the Law Center. And so I'm wondering, so because of the disputes between, in terms of interbranch disputes between the executive and the legislature, you're seeing an increased role of the judicial branch and increase in litigation. Do you see the role of the judicial branch expanding in this space to be positive, or any potential to be positive?
I can't decide which I want more of. You know, it seems the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, does not want to litigate between the other 2 branches. They go, Congress has its own tools. If they want to push back, they can. But if they won't, do the courts have some responsibility to mediate here? So I go back and forth about whether the courts are right there. You know, I think one middle ground is, I think Congress in some way should have more standing to bring some of these cases before the courts.
Yeah.
You know, if they can't push back directly to the executive branch, who is hell bent on violating the law, why can't Congress, especially the majority party, if they have the legal, you know, in the House, it's the BLAG, Bipartisan Legal Advisory Committee, which is leadership. They vote on legal strategy from the House. If one has a majority of that vote, like why can't they bring suit on funding disputes? And I think the court should be more open to the House and Senate being able to do that. I get why they're not, is because it's like they're not coming as an entire institution, but something's got to give, because I don't think we've seen in our democracy a period where an executive has just done whatever it wants to do, and you don't see a Congress respond. And I'm not talking about legislative response, this soft power. You know, we were doing something appropriation subcommittee chair didn't like, and I go to one of the secretaries and I go, I'll stand with you as long, I think you're right policy wise, but let's see once they start calling what happens. And sure enough, that appropriation subcommittee chair threatened the secretary of my colleagues, either travel budget or her ability to have staff sitting outside her door. And I got a phone call saying that she was going to do what the subcommittee chair wanted her to do. And I go, that's great. Can I cancel my calls so I can avoid being also threatened? And we did that. But that soft power was a necessity, turns out. Being able to, when I was a young appropriations staffer, we had this woman at the Capitol Police when I funded the legislative branch who was just a terrible manager. She needed to go and she does not want to leave. And while the appropriations bills, you can't have bill of attainers, you can eliminate positions, and we were prepared to do that. And that was enough for her to go consult with family and lawyers and decide it was a good time to leave. You know, Congress used to be kind of good at doing those things. They're not, because you have to have the backing of both parties. I once had an Obama administration official call me when I was doing EPA's budget and say, we will pay for you to go see this controversial mine. We won't pay for your Republican counterpart. And I go, well, I'm not going. If he can't go, and whatever he chooses to do to get back at you, I will have his back. Because it will happen to me the next time if I allow you to do that to my Republican colleague. But if that kind of stuff isn't going to happen, the courts might need to find a new normal to help. Because remember, they've also told some affected groups they don't have the equivalent of standing. So where's the give here? Like, so Congress can't stand up on behalf of itself in the court on its own. And turns out if you have an impoundment case and you were harmed, you can't either. Like that can't go on.
Okay, so we need to wrap up now. So thank you, Shalanda, for that wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming today. I think it's clear the future depends on all of us, and we thank you for being a part of it. We welcome you to join us for a light reception over here. Our guest of honor is from Louisiana, so we have some light bites inspired by her home state. We have 2 mocktails. We have this, which is people-centered punch, and we have Stronger Together. So please enjoy.
The
Thank
Stronger
you.
Together vodka?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Mocktails.